Yep.
You ready? Whenever you're ready. Our microphone, we're good? Because since we're good, we could start talking almost at any time. At any moment, we could start talking. Who knows what might happen as we start talking? The microphones might become louder. People might quiet down.
People might shut up.
That would be Rui's way of saying it. Wouldn't be my way of saying it. I would say it in much more genteel Appalachian. I'd come up with the homespun Appalachianism. All right, well, welcome to Election Watch, which I'm very pleased to say is the longest running. Is this true? This is true. How many years, John?
1982 it began.
1982, the longest running item of this nature of election analysis. We've been punditizing in the think tank space since before it was cool, and we really appreciate you being here. This is I'm going to use a word that I deplore. It is a historic election cycle this year. And it is unlike in many ways what I have covered in my 25 years as a political journalist. And we are extraordinarily glad that you are here, and we're extraordinarily glad that we have such excellent friends and colleagues to do it with.
Thank you, Chris. So again, Chris Starwalt and I, John Fortier, are the co-hosts of Election Watch, and it's a long history that we've had, and we are joined by rotating panels, including some AEI people. I'm going to start with Rui Teixeira, who we are really thrilled is with us at AEI, who spent a number of years really being one of the experts on election demographics in various places, including the Center for American Progress. Worked with us on the States of Change, I think a great project, which really looked at the way American demographics were changing. And the author of The Emerging Democratic Majority, which you'll remember from earlier, and then more recently, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. Also the Liberal Patriot blog, so I won't mention too much. Sarah Fagan is with us. She was also a former top campaign aide for George W. Bush's campaigns, as well as White House political director, the founder of campaign consulting and data analytics firms, and is the CEO at Tunnel Data, and you will maybe see her on NBC as well as other places. Mark Mellman is the CEO of the Mellman Group. He's an academically trained political scientist, but has been living in the real world of polling, if you want to call it that. Sometimes still teaches at Yale, has a column in The Hill. I noted that when you used to read The Hill and other papers as a paper version, I once had a column that sat next to his, but mine has been gone for many, many years. So you've been doing it for at least 20 years. And you will also see, Mark has a list of clients on the Democratic side in the Senate and the governorships that is one of the top lists. I'm going to start with Rui Teixeira, and Rui, we're going to go around down the line. I do want to say one more logistical thing. We're going to look for your questions after we talk a little bit, but we're also going to look for some questions for those of you watching online. And so those of you watching on C-SPAN or on the AEI feed, you could email a question to nate.moore, M-O-O-R-E, at AEI.org, or you can use the hashtag on Twitter, Election Watch AEI. So we'll look for your questions after that, but I'm going to start with Rui, who's going to tell us a little bit about the big demographic picture of where we stand in the election today.
Sure. Well, I think the big question in everybody's minds is, now that Biden has been summarily removed as a Democratic presidential nominee and replaced by Kamala Harris, what does that do broadly to the Democrats' chances? And obviously, I think it's made it a little bit better. It's entirely unclear. It's a sort of panacea for all that ails them, but clearly the race has tightened. But one thing I'm interested in looking at from the standpoint of demographics, what does the Kamala coalition really look like, at least based on what we know so far? And again, this is early days. There's been very little high-quality polling released since Biden left the race. But maybe there's enough to start to discern some of the contours of what might be the Kamala coalition. And in talking about this, I mean, obviously we're in a little bit of a silly season here in terms of how people feel about the Harris coalition and Kamala. There's been massive, basically super favorable coverage. It just blanketed the legacy media and the center-left media in general. They're extremely happy. They're just delighted. So, we're now in a situation where it's gotten to the point where people's like, oh my God, look, it's the Obama coalition, it's coming back. It's like the Obama coalition 2.0. Now, I know a little bit about election demographics, and I think people don't really understand, the demographic nature of the Obama coalition, even as the 2012 iteration, which was, far less exalted than 2008. It's pretty different than what we've seen lately, and it's pretty different than what Kamala is putting together. At least at this point, you could argue that she's really far from the Obama coalition of 2012 in terms of non-white support, working class support, and so on. I mean, it's really more like, she might be approaching or, maybe be able to get to like the Biden coalition, but with fewer working class voters. I think that's a possibility. Another possibility is to have like the Hillary coalition with way fewer white working class voters. You can also detect a signal of that potentially. So with that as preface, let me give you some numbers that I worked out based on taking the New York Times Siena poll, which is probably the best single poll to look at. I'm always reluctant to just look at one poll. I prefer averages, but very little to work with now, and this is probably the best poll out there. So what does it tell us? Okay, first of all, let's look at what it tells us about non-white working class voters, okay? I think people assume, incorrectly in my view, that having Kamala as a person of color, is really gonna solve the Democrats' non-white problem in general. And they don't even talk about the non-white working class problem because they don't get, it's pretty different than the non-white college-educated electorate. I mean, these are very important to see. We really see class polarization starting to rear its head in the non-white voting community. And because people don't realize that and don't think about that, there's like Kamala, black working class, Hispanic working class. I mean, does this really work? Here's some numbers. According to the poll that just came out from New York Times, Harris now has a 29-point lead among non-white, non-college, or working class voters, 29 points. Now that sounds pretty good, but let's run the tape backwards. In Biden's, in his 2020 election, 48-point margin. Hillary, 60 points. The last Obama election, 67 points. So to say they're not close to the Obama coalition, I think, is to somewhat understate the case. Another way to look at it is to look at the white working class. And as I said, this may emerge as a problem for Harris. According to the data that was just put out by the Times, there's a 38-point margin in favor of Trump among the white working class, 38 points. That's really big, especially when we remember that back in 2020, Biden had only a 26-point margin. Hillary was about 27 points, and Obama, remember that Obama coalition, 20-point margin. So, at least in early going, it looks like she might do much worse among white working class voters, which obviously calls the Obama coalition analogy into question. One place where she is improving, though, and this won't be a shocker to people who maybe follow this stuff reasonably closely, Obama lost white college-educated voters in 2012 by 8 points. Hillary was a wash, this is all Catalyst data. Biden carried them by 9 points. So it's a big difference between Biden and Obama. And now, according to this poll at least, Kamala is up by 15 points among white college-educated voters. So kind of, it's starting to come into focus what kind of coalition we might be talking about here. You can also look at black voters, which is, again, this is, it's going to, I'm fully, sort of sympathetic to the idea that the gap, the Democrats will get a bigger margin over time as the election gets closer. But right now, I mean, in the aftermath of Harris substituting for Biden, Harris has a 53-point margin among black voters, 53 points. That sounds great, right? But again, if you follow this stuff, that's not very big. And Biden had an 81-point margin. Hillary had an 86-point margin. And in 2012, Barack Obama had a 93-point margin. So again, we're really far away from anything that looks even vaguely like the Obama coalition. And finally, I have some other numbers here, but I don't want to overwhelm people. I think you're kind of getting the point. working class voters. I said we might be looking at the Biden coalition with fewer working class voters. In 2012, Obama, back in the halcyon days of that Democratic victory, he carried working class voters overall by 4 points. Then Hillary lost them by 3 points. Biden lost them by 4 points. And according to this latest Times data, Trump is carrying them by 15 points. So I wrote a piece about this called Forget the Hype, It's Still a Working Class Election, and I think this illustrates a dynamic people are going to want to keep an eye on because everybody's so focused on identity groups, they don't think about class anymore. And it's actually pretty important. And it may be the key to whether Harris wins or loses this election, whether her coalition is actually capable of winning, whether, what kind of coalition it resembles. From Obama, Biden coalition, Hillary coalition. But I think undergirding this, you always have to look at the issue was what's going on with working class voters across races, which may be the Achilles heel of the Harris coalition.
So Mark, when we asked you to come here, and this is a series of Election Watch events, we wanted you to talk about the state of the Democratic Party, and of course that meant President Biden as the head of it, as President Trump who hadn't been shot, all the things that you can imagine nobody would have imagined have happened now. But I think what we really like to get from you is a sort of sense of the Democratic state of the race. Where are Democrats? And to the extent that you now have a new nominee, essentially a nominee, to say a little bit about some of the differences that maybe you would see between her and maybe the pre-debate Biden.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure. One of my teachers in graduate school was the graphics guru and political statistician Ed Tufte, who loved skewering other academics for faulty or what he regarded as banal conclusions. One of his favorite objects of derision was a historian whose central thesis in a large book he wrote about the period he was studying was stated simply: it was a time of continuity and a time of change. Calling it all-purpose history, Tufte rightly claimed it could describe any time, any place, anywhere. I tell this story because that's really what I'm here to say. Offer that same banal conclusion about the Democratic Party. There are tremendous in this election. There are tremendous continuities. There are also some huge changes. Both things are true. Let's start with the continuities. My fellow Democrats here may spend a lot of time, like I do, watching CNN, where we see Jonathan Lawson pitch the 3 Ps of life insurance, which turn out to just be one: price, price, price. I have 3 Ps of politics that are actually all different. Partisanship is the first P. Most Americans have a core political identity as either a Democrat or Republican, which in a very important measure, crucially important measure, structures their view of the political world. The second P is polarization, the hostility that exists between the parties. Democrats hate Republicans much more than they ever did before. Republicans hate Democrats much more than they ever did before, and that is an important feature of our politics. The third P, in addition to partisanship and polarization, is parity. These parties are about evenly distributed in the American electorate. If you look at party identification, if you look at the generic vote for House of Representatives, it may be 1 point or 2 points one way or the other in this poll or that poll or this average or that average, but basically it's parity. It's roughly even. And those continuities play a dominant role in this race. The reality is the fact that we have that polarization, the fact that we have that parity, the fact that we have that partisanship are really the dominant features of this race, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there are also some big changes. Most important is this: we had a race that was, the fundamental fact of that race was that most Americans thought, wrongly in my view, but most Americans thought that Joe Biden was ill-equipped physically, mentally, to discharge his responsibilities as president. You can look at different questions and get different answers, but somewhere between half and 3/4 of the American public had those doubts about President Biden. That was the single most important, unique fact about this election. Parity, the 3 Ps, those come with every election in recent times, but we have never had an election before where that number of people thought one candidate or the other was unable to discharge the responsibilities. And that's gone. In less than 5 minutes, it was completely gone. So the major factor that was structuring this race beyond those great continuities, the major unique factor that was attaching itself to this race was gone all of a sudden. Not a lot of numbers moved right away. See the big 3 Ps above. But dollars started pouring into the Harris campaign. Volunteers are showing up to knock on doors. There's a really palpable change in the mood and the level of excitement. So that's one big change. Second, she has, Vice President Harris, has obviously some ownership of the record of this administration, but it's not quite the same level of ownership that the president has. There are areas where she can differ, things that she might have done differently, and so on. So that's another major factor that changes in this race. Third, C.1 about Biden's infirmities or alleged infirmities, but the reality is this was a race where the Democrats wanted very much to be about Donald Trump. It was becoming very much about Joe Biden because of those alleged infirmities. It is now a race very much about both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, and that, frankly, works to the advantage of Democrats and leaves, I think, the Republicans sort of unsure about where to go. Just to give you a sense of the numbers here, and I think it's important, if you look at the averages, before the debate, Joe Biden was running 1.5 points behind Donald Trump on average in Real Clear Politics, and most of them, they're slightly different, but they're all about the same. After the debate, it moved about 0.5 point. Right after the debate, it moved somewhere between 0.5 point and 1 point against Biden. The big thing that happened was not the debate, it was the coverage after the debate and the Democratic reaction after the debate, when your own people, the famous book was written by a Leninist during the Stalinist purges called Our Own People, about how our own people were killing each other in the show trials and so on. Well, here you had our own people going on TV explaining why Joe Biden was not fit to be president. That hurts. It hurts a lot. And that's when we saw the race move to -3 for Biden from a relatively small movement after the debate itself. Now, with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, it's back to about -1.7. So again, a little worse than it was going into the debate, still behind. But there's, I think, a couple things to remember about these numbers. First of all, they're very close. And they reflect, and if you look at the swing states, they also have been pretty close. They're back to being pretty close again. 1 or 2 points either way. But the reality is there is a difference between this year and 4 years ago. 4 years ago, it was also 1 or 2 points on the national numbers, and in the swing states, 1, 2, 3 points either way. But in every single swing state and in every single aggregated national poll, Joe Biden was ahead. Today, in every swing state, most swing states, let's say, and in every national poll, in aggregate, Donald Trump is ahead. And that is a real difference from where we were before. But we are seeing this improvement manifest itself first and perhaps foremost for the moment in states that were blue, that all of a sudden the Trump people would have you believe were competitive. We're not going to see even polls in Minnesota anymore. We're back to high single-digit margins. States like New Hampshire that they thought they might be able to sneak into, again, just not going to be really possible for the Trump campaign. We're back to these relatively few swing states and tremendous possibility for Democrats, but tremendous uncertainty as well.
Well, I'll save you from your analogy of the Democratic factions as Leninists and Stalinists. So, you stepped in it, but maybe we could ask just a little bit about how Kamala Harris might be different than the pre-debate Biden, and maybe in particular, one issue, of course, that was dividing the Democratic Party was the question of Israel and Gaza, and we have a vice president who's been part of that administration, but I think we've had some quiet over the summer, at least relative quiet, with the campus protests being done. But people worry that this is an issue that still will divide the Democratic Party. Does it? What does Kamala Harris look like on this issue, and is it still the divisive issue and one that you would worry about as a Democratic pollster?
So I don't worry about it that much, honestly. I worry about demonstrations, and I worry about the potential for violent demonstrations. I worry that that feeds into the Trump narrative of chaos in the country, anti-Americanism on the part of the left, and so on. So I do worry about it, but I don't worry about the issue so much in terms of the Democratic Party. The evidence, I think, is actually very clear about this. Most Americans believe the United States should support Israel in its conflict with Hamas. Number one, that's true of most Democrats as well as most Americans. Number two, there's almost no evidence that this had any effect on Joe Biden's approval rating. Quite the contrary. We did a poll, actually, we asked people whether they approved or disapproved of Biden's handling of the war. Most people disapproved. We asked them why they disapproved. The smallest number said it was because he was too supportive of Israel. The next largest number said it was because he was too supportive of the Palestinians. And the largest number said it had nothing to do with which side he was on. They just didn't like the way he was handling it. And so, again, I don't think this is going to be terribly divisive in the party. We had a debate about the platform. That platform was passed unanimously by the platform committee. There were no amendments even on this subject. That's not to say that people won't try and do something at the convention. It's not to say there won't be protest. I worry about the protest and the response to the protest much more than the substance of the issue itself.
Sarah, can you talk again? The things have changed a lot since we asked you to come here as well, but thinking about the Republican side, and especially, are there lingering divisions within the party from the primaries or other things that you'd like to point out in the Republican electorate?
Yeah, I mean, look, there is no doubt that this has been the wildest month in presidential politics, likely in history, certainly in all of our lifetimes. And so in one respect, everything has changed. It has been incredibly dramatic, but in some respects, nothing has changed. And, I think Mark makes an excellent point about where the ballot was before the debate that largely took down Joe Biden's candidacy, did take down Joe Biden's candidacy. The race was, 1.5, 1.7, whatever you think. And today, if you look at the data, it's roughly the same. We can quibble over 0.2 of a point, but essentially the race is back where it was. You start this 100-day period where you have both candidates with some strengths, but a lot of weaknesses. You have, one individual who is starting her campaign with a 39% job approval rating. Sub 40%, one would argue, based on that alone, she's not going to get elected. Now, there's a lot of time. There's some energy in the Democratic Party. She'll have a chance to give a convention speech. She'll have a chance to be on the debate stage with Donald Trump. And those things could change. But, the Democrats walk into this general election slightly better in some respects and slightly worse than they were with Joe Biden. And so from that vantage point, I think we're going to have a lot of the same conversation we would have had we, been sitting here in early June. Donald Trump, post-assassination attempt, which I think the thing that happened there that was probably most helpful politically, it's hard to talk about a potential loss of life in political terms, but nonetheless, if you're thinking about politics, I think there were a bunch of that kind of Bush Republican coalition who was not for him, who looked at it and said, whoa, this is a bridge too far. It's this is not okay, and I'm going to be for him now. And whether that holds, we will see. It's amazing how 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks later, it's not even the most talked about presidential topic. We're talking about a new nominee. We're talking about a potential Democratic nominee, and whether that's the senator from Arizona or the governor from Pennsylvania or somebody else. That's now driving the debate, not an assassination attempt. In terms of key groups, Joe Biden won independents by 13 points in 2020. Who wins independents in this election probably is the president. Other key groups, much has been debated over the weekend about the death of the double hater. So much focus on double haters, people who dislike both the Republican and the Democratic nominees. I think that group will still be a significant group in this election. When you have nominees that have 35, 37, 39% job approval ratings, there are definitely going to be some double haters. That group of voters in 2016 broke to Donald Trump. It's one of the reasons Hillary Clinton did not win the presidency. I think that group will be incredibly important. And then I think very much the group of kind of traditional mainstream Republicans, what do they do in this election? And certainly if you think about Donald Trump's selection of J.D. Vance, he was not thinking about that group, without a doubt. There's nothing in that VP pick that says to a traditional mainstream, foreign policy hawk that this is the direction we're going to go in and be comfortable with. I do think J.D. Vance, to Rui's points, in many ways was an excellent pick because it really cements that working class and voter. And even though Donald Trump has strong appeal among that base of the Republican Party, he does not have cultural commonality with that group of voters. And J.D. Vance does. And J.D. Vance takes, I think, things even a step further, is that for people who aren't paying much attention to a presidential race, you see a movie on Netflix, you hear about a book, he is an incredibly relatable figure for a lot of people who look at the world and say, it's very hard to get ahead. And here's an individual who had a very compelling life story and was able to get ahead. And that connectivity, I think, helps him tremendously. Having said all that, 15% of the Republican electorate in the primaries was voting for Nikki Haley long after she got out of the race. So in a world where Kamala Harris is able to bring back enthusiasm into the Democratic base, which there certainly appears to be data that suggests that, in a world where she consolidates additional support among Black voters, Hispanic voters, peels back some working class voters, and puts back together more of a traditional Democratic coalition, that 15% becomes a very important coalition. And so from that piece of information alone, a different VP select may have been better for Donald Trump. But that's not where we are. J.D. Vance certainly will bring a lot of assets, brings a lot of assets, will continue to bring assets. But that was a missed opportunity. So what happens to that 15% of the electorate? Do they look at the assassination attempt on Donald Trump? Do they look at VP Harris's politics, which are to the left of the sitting presidents, without a doubt? She's to the left. I don't think that group goes to the Democrats. I think the question is, do they sit out? Do they show up with enthusiasm? Do they throw a few votes to a third party? But I do think becomes a very important group in this electorate. So what to watch for? There are very few opportunities now to sort of have big news. It's hard to imagine that we would have anything like the events of the last month, but the few opportunities that remain, certainly the VP selection that the Democrats make, that Kamala makes, Senator Mark Kelly, Governor Josh Shapiro, these are incredibly compelling individuals from very important states, and there will be a lot of excitement and narrative around that when it happens. Does it ultimately matter? Probably not a lot, but it may put a state in play that otherwise, Donald Trump is, ahead 3 to 5 points in potentially today, probably 1 or 2 in Pennsylvania. I would watch a lot for convention chaos in the Democratic. It doesn't feel like it today that the news coverage around the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is such that we're going to see that. But should there be demonstrations in the hall every night? Should there be people burning American flags? That will be very problematic, and that is something that certainly I'm sure the organizers have thought of and are working diligently to prevent, but they did get protesters into the U.S. Congress a week ago and dumped a bunch of maggots on the table of a sitting world leader. So it proves that they will go to there's no length that these protesters will go to make noise, and so that will be problematic for the Democrats should it happen. The debates are certainly another big opportunity, both the presidential and the VP debates. the Trump sentencing in New York, which, we sort of forget that there's any court cases after the news of the last several weeks, but it's an open question whether that will occur. But there's potential for some sort of September, news event that becomes a big story, at least for a week. While it hasn't impacted Donald Trump's standing much this year, that is always the potential for that. And then I think sort of lastly, what happens with third parties. Robert F. Kennedy, what ballots does he get on? Joe Stein is I believe, on the Wisconsin and Michigan ballots. Again, that proved to be very problematic for Hillary Clinton. I suspect that it'll be problematic for Kamala Harris as well. And so what happens with those third-party candidates? What percentage of the electorate do they take in the states that matter? And so when you sort of put all of this together, I'd expect it to be an incredibly close race, which is what we would have said in early June, and it's, I think, what we're probably all anticipating sitting here today.
So Chris and I, in addition to, I think Chris will say some other things too, but we definitely want to cover some of the things that you may have in your handout, which is some of the Senate races, governor's races, and others. So Chris, take it away.
Oh, paperwork, exciting. I do want to say a couple of things. One is that John and Rui and I don't need any reminder of how good it is to have AEI in the world. But I just think that you should appreciate that in Washington, D.C. today, to have a real Republican and a real Democrat, people who are working in their parties, in their fields, who are respected, who can come to someplace and have a candid conversation about things and be advocates for a position, but talk frankly, is extraordinarily rare in Washington today, and it's super cool. So I am very grateful to these two lovely human beings for being here today.
And we even sit them next to each other, too.
I know, exactly. The other thing that I want to say is, as a general framing, my colleague at the Dispatch, Kevin Williamson, has a piece today talking about politics as fashion, something you put on. Policies, and I was struck by it listening to you guys talking, which was, the policies matter, no doubt. But for voters for whom policies matter, they're probably not very persuadable, right? If you really care, if you're deeply driven by policy questions, you're probably not up for grabs in the election. But what Democrats had was a coalitional problem because the style was bad. Joe Biden was too old, and it wasn't one particular policy, and what really got me thinking was your mention of the Israel policy. It wasn't that it was this way or that way, it was that it was him. And now for Democrats, they feel good about their fashion. They like their style now. They like what they're putting on. And they feel good about what it says to the world, which increases enthusiasm. And Republicans, we saw at their convention, feel really good about their style. Holy crocono, they feel excellent about their style. They had a guy rip his shirt off on stage, and they all got really excited. So the Republicans feel really good about their style. And now Democrats feel good about their style too. And what we'll get to see now is how that, and I don't like the term double haters. I think that I don't like introducing hate into the American political discussion. But for fed up people who don't like either fashion, particularly, where they fall is going to decide this election. Where are the unicorns going to go? The people who are high propensity voters, but with low partisan salience. They don't feel strongly identified with either team, but they vote frequently. And the parties are going to spend billions of dollars harassing and annoying those people. So if you have any friends who live in Georgia or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, just keep a prayer in your heart for them if they're persuadable voters. Okay, Democrats have lost the Senate. I can't say it for sure today, but they've given up on West Virginia. Republicans only need one seat to take it to even up. And West Virginia is off the table. You all saw Baby Dog from my home state of West Virginia. If you won't do it for me, do it for Baby Dog. And Joe Manchin dropped out, and the Democrats are going to take it. The Democrats are giving up West Virginia. Okay. But now if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, they could still hold on, right? They could still hold on to the Senate because if they just get it to 50, her vice president can cast the deciding vote. It was good enough for Democrats in the Biden administration to hold on to a Senate majority, and it would be good enough again. But that means they have to play perfect, they have to pitch a perfect baseball game in all of these other races. How likely is that? Okay, the hardest ones for Democrats to hold, you start with Montana. Montana is a demographically changing place, and there's reason to believe that Democrats have a better future in Montana, and they have a pretty good past. And John Tester is very well suited to the state. He lines up really well. But I think it's going to be real tough. I think it's going to be real tough because as those fashions, as the people put on their jerseys and say, I'm this team and you're that team, and that's what happens in these quadrennial elections, is people get more, the states become more like what they are. They act more like themselves, and their polities go in that direction. So in Montana, it's going to get more Republican-y, right? It's going to get more Republican. It's going to be very hard for Tester. Ohio, Sherrod Brown. Now this is the J.D. Vance question. In hindsight, the J.D. Vance pick looks almost reckless, right? And I feel confident that if the Democrats had switched their ticket before the Republican convention, Donald Trump would not have picked. And we'll say that J.D. Vance is a very niche kind of choice because it's not a respectful disagreement. I don't think it is that he connects with people who share his story. I think he connects with a group of national conservative, ardent Roman Catholic. There is a subset of the Republican Party, the Tucker Carlsonian subset of the Republican Party, that has intensely good feelings about J.D. Vance, and that this is the message. But he also is this huge turnoff for women, right? The crazy cat lady line and all that stuff basically says to the numbers that Rui was talking about, you just continue to push those numbers apart further and further. College-educated women, the J.D. Vance pick for Donald Trump says to college-educated suburban women, we can win without you. We don't actually need you. We don't need Nikki Haley primary voters. We don't need any of you people. We don't need, crazy cat ladies not welcome here. We can do it with just our base. And to Rui's point, the base is getting really good for Republicans, right? They've really got the working class and increasingly a diverse working class. We will get to test it in Ohio. There's no reason that with J.D. Vance on the ticket that Sherrod Brown should be able to hang on in Ohio. It's home state running mate. He's a sitting senator. There isn't a scenario in which if J.D. Vance is doing at least some good for Donald Trump, that it shouldn't have some serious consequences for Sherrod Brown, because the point of the national conservatism or the working class republicanism is to get rid of guys like Sherrod Brown, who's an old school working class Democrat, the old school blue collar, union facing. So this is directed right at the heart of that. So we get a test case in the Ohio Senate race, and how well the Republican ticket is performing, you'll have a great little microcosm. Every time you see an Ohio Senate poll come out, you're going to get a little snapshot on what's the Vance effect. Nevada, Republicans, and I think just, I'll conclude by saying this generally speaking. You have the races in front of you. We could have told you the same thing in 2010, in 2012, in 2014, in 2016, 18, 20, 22. What's the story with Republicans in the United States Senate? Well, the map looks okay, actually. Can they get the candidates, right? Can they get the candidates? And we saw in 2022 that the Republicans could not get the candidates. They got goofballs. They had a former television healer in Pennsylvania. They had Herschel Walker in Georgia, which was just wild. Like, they were doing it, and I thought, no, they're not really, and they did it. And there's no reason that Georgia should have not just a Democrat, but a progressive Democrat representing it in the Senate, except for the fact that the Republicans didn't want to win, and they had to nominate Herschel Walker, which was a super weird, bad choice. And they did it in Pennsylvania. They did it with the Arizona governorship. How are they doing this time at being weird or not weird? pretty good. The Republicans are doing a pretty good job of being not weird so far. And this reflects a truce that the party made with Donald Trump. And you saw Steve Daines, the head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, go to Trump basically and say, let's make a deal. I'm going to endorse you early. I'm going to show you the love. We're going to have no fights here, but you can't ruin my races, right? You can't ruin my races. We saw it in Montana, where Trump got out of the way and let the better candidate go forward instead of Matt Rosendale. We see it in Pennsylvania. Dave McCormick if Dave McCormick would have been running against John Fetterman, Dave McCormick would be in the United States Senate today. I have no question about that. I have no doubt about that. They didn't do so great in Wisconsin, but I didn't ever particularly think that Tammy Baldwin was that vulnerable in Wisconsin. But overall, they did okay, and Nevada is the best example. That in a race, and Nevada has a weird Republican Party, that very likely could have produced a weirdo. They got a non-weirdo. They got the good candidate, Sam Brown, military history, mainstream, attractive to different kinds of Republicans. So I think the Republicans' chances of taking the Senate are exceptionally good. Carrie Lake, what can you do? What can you do? Into every life, a little rain must fall. But I think the Republicans' chances for winning the Senate are extraordinarily good. And if the election had been held in the last days of Biden's candidacy, they'd have picked up some stragglers too, right? They'd have flipped a couple. You look at Nevada, you look at Wisconsin, and you look at other states, and you go, oh, a couple tip in. Last thing I'll say: how many Senate races in 2020 went the opposite direction of the presidential? How many states split their ticket from in the bag? One. How many are going to split this time? Maybe one, right? Maybe two would be wow. So basically, the winner of the presidential race is going to get the Senate to go with them in most likelihoods. And that raises the stakes for a lot of voters, because that means that whoever comes in 2025 is likely to do so with at least half of the Congress. And that's how I set up my colleague to talk about the House.
Thank you, Chris. And so your bottom line is that Republicans have all sorts of opportunities, and that's
Totally.
their advantage. And as I might coin a Chris Starwaltism, it's like a mosquito at a nudist colony.
There you
right?
go.
There you go. So you have your wet elephants. I can come back with that. So I'm here to talk about a few things. One, quickly, the House, the couple of only two governor's races, and then say something about the vice presidential choice. So first, the House. Of course, the House is very close. I think my bottom line is the House is very likely to reflect the winner. The winner of the presidential race is likely to get the majority of the House. It is, again, so close. And just some few underlying things. We've had some redistricting changes. They've been kind of a wash. We've had some pluses for Republicans in North Carolina and some pluses for Democrats in the South, in Alabama, Louisiana, and a little bit of New York. The Republicans have a small lead, but they also, there are more seats that are Republicans sitting in Biden seats than there are Democrats sitting in Democrats sitting in Trump seats. If you wanted to look regionally and say, could something really break if the race were to move one way or the other? Some of these seats are in certain places. I mean, California and New York, Republicans have some potential exposure if things were to go well for Vice President Harris and move things along. I suspect you would see that majority that she would get built on New York and California. And Republicans, I think, in the Midwest, there are a number of seats in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin not so much on the Republican side, Pennsylvania, but a number of seats in that area. So I think we should watch, but I think basically we should expect that the House will reflect what the presidential election will happen. In the governor's races, really, we don't have that much to talk about. We really have two competitive governor's races, one in New Hampshire. Chris Sununu is stepping down, and that's a competitive race with Republicans potentially. The primary hasn't even happened yet, so we don't know the candidates, but both sides have relatively strong candidates. The Republicans, Kelly Ayotte may come back into office. She may be the winner of that, but we'll have to see. It's a competitive race. And in North Carolina, we have again a governor stepping down, term limited, Roy Cooper, who's a potential potential vice presidential pick is himself, but that race is also competitive with the AG, Josh Stein, running against the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson. I think some think Robinson has been inflammatory in many comments. On the other hand, they're both statewide elected officials. This is likely to be a very, very strong race, a very competitive race. So I would point to those two. I guess going to the vice presidential race or the vice presidential selection, I want to caution everyone, I think this is the issue that every year we talk about as being politically salient, much more than it is. Every piece of evidence shows that people don't vote for the vice president. If you really like Kamala Harris or really dislike Donald Trump or vice versa, is it really going to sway your opinion that they picked a slightly better vice president and that number 2 person is going to be there? You're very likely to vote at the top of the ticket. That doesn't mean that there aren't some optics and some windows into the world where you can look at the candidates, the presidential candidates. Who did they pick? What does that say about their decision making? Does it make it a little bit easier for them on the campaign trail? But really, electoral change because of a vice presidential nominee, I think people talk about it as we're going to combine the strengths of Donald Trump with a different faction of the party, and then everybody will be happy and everybody will go home. It doesn't typically work that way. So I guess I want to say, J.D. Vance, at least polling-wise, hasn't had a great start. Again, I would kind of say, well, maybe it isn't as big a factor as people are making it out to be. And then on the picking of the vice presidential nominee, which I'm still interested in, even though I don't think it has a electoral significance. It's obviously important for the most important reason, if something were to happen to the future president, to step in. Also, vice presidents have become important governing partners, people to work with, and on the campaign trail. So I think it's important to have somebody you like and will fit those roles. And so thinking about Vice President Harris and how she picks a potential vice presidential nominee, one thing I think that people are forgetting is she is on a very short time frame here. And I, back in 2016, was part of a group that brought together Democrats and Republicans who'd been in the rooms of the past campaigns and picking the vice presidential nominee. And we put out an interesting report, you can still find it, but the couple of pieces of advice that were big were, one, you have to get to know these people, right? That many times the presidential nominee doesn't really know very well the person they're picking. And yes, Kamala Harris has been the vice president, but does she know a lot of these governors that well? I mean, famously, John McCain picked Sarah Palin, really having met her twice, maybe very in short period of time. And the ideal way to do that really is to have some time, and Donald Trump had some time to do this, to audition the people, essentially, to bring them out there on the campaign trail with you, to see how you feel, how you like them or not. And then secondly, the second part is to vet them. And it's not that that can't be done quickly, but it's actually somewhat more extensive, and it's a little tricky to vet them in a sense of you don't have official government resources, you don't have the FBI to vet them, you have your own private lawyers. So this takes a little bit of time, and in 2016, I think people were worried Donald Trump would pick somebody just on the spur of the moment, not really think about it. He did have a more traditional process then, but by the fact that President Harris is forced to pick a nominee, perhaps not even by the convention, but perhaps by August 7th or early August when they might have a kind of pre-convention vote, that's a tough period of time. So I think, again, electorally, it's probably not going to be the biggest factor, but I do think she is under the gun in a way that other people have not been in the past, and that's probably not an advantage. Most people we're talking about are moderate white guys, moderate white governors, particularly a few moderate white senators. I can say what the betting wisdom is now, but I guess again, given how quickly this has all happened in a short period of time, I don't rule out that it could be somebody different, but people are talking about Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, and Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota. At least the first two being clear swing states that would be very good for Democrats to do well in. Neither of them are super experienced people either. Kelly's been in the Senate for 3.5 years, and Josh Shapiro has been governor for 1.5 years, although was attorney general for a while before. Others mentioned Roy Cooper, Andy Beshear, J.B. Pritzker, kind of, again, moderate white guys from maybe not so much Kentucky, but certainly from North Carolina, a swing state, so somebody that might look forward to at least help them get into that campaign. But I guess I don't absolutely rule out that she'll go in another direction. Pete Buttigieg, in some ways, I see that as unlikely, but it would be a different message. It would be a sort of sending of a kind of the new coalition message rather than trying to have someone to balance you as well. And then, you might note the couple of candidates who seem clearly going to be 2028 candidates, especially if Vice President Harris does not win. One of them, Gretchen Whitmer, is essentially taking herself out of the race. I don't think that would be a terrible choice for her, and maybe Gretchen Whitmer doesn't want to do it. But again, she at least has said that, but sometimes people change their minds. And then Gavin Newsom, who you have this sort of electoral college problem here of two people from California. Now that can be gotten around. One person could move. It's not a legal barrier really as much as a rhetorical barrier. But again, I think these are people that you obviously would say would be major Democratic figures potentially running for the nomination in 2028 who probably are not on the list, but maybe in the background. So I will end with that to again say, I think all of us probably have reflected a little bit that we think we're back to where we began before Joe Biden's debate performance. And for the House, I think that absolutely means, again, a very close result, probably favoring the person who wins. And the vice presidential choice, an interesting thing to watch for, and we've got a lot of names, but I don't see that as something that's going to tip the race in any particular way. All right, well, I think we should, Chris, you and I should take a little bit of time to follow up with our fellow panelists here, and then we should open it up to the room. So I want people in the room to get their questions ready, and also for those who are watching online, if you want to email a question to nate.moore, M-O-O-R-E, at aei.org, or use the hashtag ElectionWatchAEI on Twitter X.
And if you have any barbecue recipes or tips on where to get 90s vintage fashion, send them to Nate also. He's ready for that. I'm curious to hear from Rui, but all of you, the changing lanes of the parties. The Republican coalition looks like the old Democratic coalition, and the Democratic coalition looks like the old Republican coalition. How am I oversimplifying that?
Oh yeah, you're oversimplifying.
Okay, that's good. I'm in TV. That's good. That's
but
right.
I do think there's a resemblance there to what you're saying. I mean, the parties have. I mean, the most obvious way is in which they've switched sort of working class support bases. I mean, Republicans now reliably get a greater share of the working class vote overall than Democrats. So that didn't used to be the case. The Democrats used to be more, it was a cliche. The Democrats are the working class party, country club Republicans and all that kind of stuff. And you look at the way the parties are evolving in terms of their coalition, and clearly neither one of those is the case. Democrats are no longer the working class party, and certainly Republicans, it's kind of silly to think of them as just country club party.
The voter propensity is a problem for Republicans because Republicans used to have this advantage. The rule basically is more educated, more affluent people voted a higher propensity. And when the Republican coalition rested in the suburbs and rested on more affluent, aspirational people in the old coalition, they punched above their weight, and it was hard for Democrats to get their folks out. Turnout was a problem. How do Republicans address the new role?
Well, I think that there's some of that. We are still going through this shift, so it's you end up with suburban voters being a huge swing block, right? Because they're sort of caught between they're college educated, which means they're kind of shifting to the left, but they're still pretty conservative on a lot of economic issues, and they're moving to the right. And so turnout is an issue. But I think more interesting to me, and there's time will tell how this all moves, is Rui's analysis on working class blacks and Hispanics, and their shift toward the Republican Party, which the Democrats may still win a majority of those voters, but the percentages will be significantly changed. And how do Republicans capitalize on that and do a better job of speaking to minority voters as a whole. And I think that will be very important long term. And how does that coalition get put together? And then, kind of ultimately, I think there are still a lot of Republicans who look at a traditional foreign policy and say, I'm for that. I didn't love Iraq. I didn't love what happened in Afghanistan. But generally, I think a strong America is a good force in the world and a necessary force in the world. And so what happens to that coalition of voters, both on the right and the left?
So for Democrats so now we have the other ear of the Mickey Mouse balloon, which is accepting these very kinds of voters that Sarah describes. Suburban tend to be economically more conservative. They're not, and on social issues and cultural issues, they feel some anxiety, especially parents. They're concerned about some of these things. They don't want to vote for Donald Trump. Democrats have had what do they call it?
But they don't want to vote for Kamala Harris either right now.
Yeah. I think as the youths call it, a situationship. They had a situationship with Joe Biden where they said, okay, we can do this one time. I call them Youngkin Biden voters. We can do this one time. I'll do it. We got to keep Trump out of there. What's the messaging for Democrats to keep these high propensity, highly valuable, persuadable voters in their camp?
Well, first of all, I disagree with the premise a bit, which is to say that, yes, these are swing voters to an important extent, but honestly, on the cultural issues, if you will, they line up with Democrats pretty strikingly, and that's why they became Democrats in the first instance. Why they started voting for Democrats is because of those cultural issues. So the J.D. Vance comments, the Trump comments, really helped to move them in our direction, and I think that goes back to what I said before. Democrats were looking for this race to be a race about Donald Trump. To the extent it is about Donald Trump for those people, it's very helpful from our point of view.
Yeah. And a couple things. One, Sarah mentioned that there are third-party candidates, and obviously Jill Stein has been one several times. But Hillary Clinton did a pretty good job of keeping, and Joe Biden of keeping, or actually Biden especially, keeping some of them off the ballot. Do we still feel like the overall effect of all the third-party candidates, of course that includes RFK Jr., is slightly better for Republicans? I know there's been this thought. Do you feel like it's a slightly better case for them to be in the race than for Democrats if they're on the ballot?
Yes. I mean, if you just look at Jill Stein alone, I mean, Green Party candidacy in at least 3 of the 6 to 7 target states, and you pulled 2% or 3% in a close election that matters. There's more of an open question to me about who Robert F. Kennedy pulls from, and I think there's evidence that he pulls from both. It's also unclear to me where he's going to be on the ballot if more than one consequential state. But in a close election, if Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan goes to Trump, he probably is the president. So that's where these things on the margins become very consequential.
And then I guess for Mark, what I would have said before the Biden performance at the debate was that not only was it a close race, but these were the 2 most well-known candidates one could imagine, right? They're 2 incumbents essentially. Kamala Harris isn't exactly that, right? She's the vice president. People know her, but you'd be surprised how few people might know not that much about her. She didn't run through a primary season. It seems like there's more possibility for change, both good and bad. What would you say about just the compressed time frame for all these things she has to do to sort of introduce herself, to take her advantages, to shore up her weaknesses? I mean, it does seem like all of this is happening very quickly. I mean, one other example is when you're like Al Gore, a vice president of Bill Clinton, there was this whole dance of how much do I say I was part of the Clinton administration, how much am I my own person, and she's got to do all that in just a few weeks. So what would you say about her up and down chances compared to it was before?
It's really an interesting question, and the truth is I think that compressed timetable actually works for her in an important way, which is to say You're absolutely right. People do not know her well, and it would be a mistake to assume they do. They don't. But she's, there's little time here. She has a great week of press over the first week, which we've been through. That's one of those weeks gone and done, and there's fewer weeks to go. You're checking off weeks. So the truth is, there is limited opportunity for her to get her positive message across, but there's also more limited opportunity for all the negative things that can happen. And each week that passes where she's won the week, and I think it's fair to say she won this week by a long shot, every week she wins, it brings her closer to the presidency.
Rui.
One thing I think is worth putting in here that we haven't really talked about is, yeah, she has a limited time frame. A lot of people don't know much about her. She's still behind. She still has the demographic weaknesses that I identified. She still has to do better among working class voters. She still has to lock down the persuadable, suburban, college, moderate women, blah, 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 whatever. So how do you do that? I mean, one way you do it is by reassuring them you're not, you're different from Biden. You're a different kind of Democrat. You're more toward the center instead of more to the left. And, you do that by taking different positions on race, crime, immigration, gender. There's a variety of things you could do. You don't have to do them all, but signal to people out there, you're not just going to be the president of democratic America or the president of online America with all those memes and stuff that they're so happy about. You'll be the president of all America. And you do that by signaling that you are, in fact, more moderate, not more left than Joe Biden. And on evidence so far, it is very hard to detect an interest in doing that. I think, she's gotten that advice. Lots of people have written it. I've written it, David. I mean, it's not rocket science, but is there any interest in doing that? There's no evidence she's moving to the center on any of these issues. In fact, she's essentially following the same playbook. Talk a lot about abortion. Talk a lot about, democracy's on the ballot. And to the extent she has an economic program, it's like we're going to do what we did before, except more of it. And we're going to spend more money. And it's about the care economy and whatever. I mean, I think this is music to the ears of partisan Democrats. But is it music to the ears of persuadable working class and suburban moderate voters? That's not clear to me at all. And you look at kind of her history, you look at the kind of politician she is, and you look at like what she's sensitive to, the pressures and so on, it's really a little hard to see her being a profile in courage and coming out there and saying, I am a different kind of Democrat in the following way. And yet that would probably be, I think, the smart play for her. But I think it's hard.
Rui exists in the context of all that came before him, and he is
unburdened, baby.
He is very right. He's unburdened, flourishing. The candidates who win are candidates that wink. Ronald Reagan didn't have to spend any time in 1980 sucking up to conservatives because they already knew he made his bones in '76. Barack Obama didn't have to waste any time in 2008 sucking up to progressives because his name was Barack Hussein Obama and he was from the south side of Chicago and he beat Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump can say anything he wants. This is the amazing thing. Donald Trump changes positions on abortions like changing his hairstyle. He just is like, whatever, we'll do it. We'll try it this way. And if you don't like that, what's the Marx Brothers line? These are our positions. And if you don't like these, we have others. And Republicans give Trump this extraordinary lot of latitude to change his positions on things that he think will be politically useful. What I'm desperate to know about Democrats, are they going to let Kamala Harris win? They let Barack Obama win, right? They let him win. They didn't say like, wait a minute, we need you to pick a running mate. We need you to say things to soothe us and make us feel better the whole time. Or will Democrats, do you think, let Kamala Harris run to the middle and find that space?
It's a $1 million question. I agree with Rui. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that. I think the bigger problem is that she doesn't have any really core governing philosophy, and
which can be helpful.
It can be helpful, but ultimately, I think there were a lot of mainstream Republicans who looked at Joe Biden and said, he's moving to the left on Israel, and he's moving to the left on this green energy stuff, but like we kind of know deep down he's not really for it. Like he's kind of culturally one of us, but I think the opposite is true with her. I think the perception is that she is a San Francisco liberal. She is, in fact, a San Francisco liberal, and I think the perception is that she is a San Francisco liberal. And I think, you know, this is where I agree with Mark. The short time horizon is probably her friend. That there is less time to have a conversation about what it is she does or doesn't believe. And her instinct is abortion, abortion. Let me just keep talking about abortion. If I can keep talking about abortion, I might win this election. And, you know, there are other social issues that are very problematic for the Democratic Party right now. And that is, you know, where the center of the country says, we've litigated gay marriage and we're okay with it, and we're not interested in having a fight with gay Americans. But on the transgender issues, I think that is a very different equation. And in suburban America, everybody has an example of something that happened in one school somewhere, you know, in a different part of town that, you know, is now talked about widely as something that's, even though it's not happening everywhere, the perception is it's happening everywhere. And I think that is very problematic. And to your point on gender issues, does she come out and say something that says, you know, before 18, we shouldn't have mixed bathrooms, or before 18, we shouldn't, and I don't think she's not going to do that, because she's going to placate to her progressive base.
But Mark, what do you say?
So look, first of all, she's only had a week at top of the ticket. So as you said, John, she can't do everything in a week. So the fact that she hasn't done it so far doesn't mean she's not going to do it, whatever it might be, number one. Number two, I think the reality is people do not want a politics based on hate. And I think that is what Donald Trump is peddling. I think that's what J.D. Vance is peddling. And I think that is something that middle Americans, suburban Americans, most Americans don't like, want to reject. And that is important from the point of view of Vice President Harris. Third, are Democrats going to let her win? You bet. You bet. You will not find, that's an exaggeration. You will find extremely few people, very few people, if any, who will criticize anything she says or does between now and November. Will they demur a little bit? In some cases, they might. But the reality is, for Democrats, beating Donald Trump is absolutely central in this election. That is the central question of this election, is whether or not Donald Trump's going to be the president. Democrats, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, fairly or unfairly, I think fairly, think the existence of this country as a democracy is dependent on the outcome of this election, and they are going to let Kamala Harris do whatever she needs to do to win in her mind.
We're going to turn to most of the American people in this room and other people in this room for questions. As I've mentioned several times before, we might get some online questions. So there is a mic, and the mic will come to you. And if you could please identify yourself and ask a question. So we're going to go right here.
Right up front.
Right, in the red here.
That's my protest. I didn't get the question I wanted. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Myrtle Alexander, Dr. Myrtle Alexander, and I'm actually running for Congress in District of Columbia. So my question is regards to Kamala Harris, because she has history in Black America per se. So how do we look at her when she has broken up so many families by way of the justice system and what she did there with the imprisonment of so many Black men? How do Black men see her now when it comes to the vote? And then also, when we look at the genocide of the unborn, as we look at that, how do we expect her to have a winning ticket when we look at those factors?
Well, when you look at those factors that way, you may not expect a winning ticket, but not everybody looks at them that way. So the reality is, again, the overwhelming majority of Americans are pro-choice. Don't think the government ought to be making that decision. Don't consider that, I can't remember the phrase you used, but don't consider it in the light that you defined it. And that's a fact in terms, and I don't speak for Black men, obviously, but the reality is she has been tough on crime, which is, I think, is what you're alluding to. On the other hand, she is African American, and I think that that has a certain ethnic appeal to other African Americans, just in and of itself, as it would for any other group to see some, as it did to Catholics when John F. Kennedy was running for president. The reality is there is an identification there that I think is, and certainly when Barack Obama was running for president, There is an ethnic identification there that I think is very important, that supersedes some of the specific policies that people may or may not agree with. But again, what you're saying is she's a heartland conservative on the same evidence that Sarah's saying she's a San Francisco liberal. So it's a little, perhaps it means he's just right in the middle.
Can I just maybe pose a question a slightly different way, maybe for Rui or for all of you? And that is, this question of, to the extent that there is some movement among Hispanics and African Americans, we talked about the class issue, that maybe there's some more working class movement to the Republican Party. There's also, those people are more male than female. Can we say something about the male black vote? And whether we think, we have now a new candidate who is both African American but not male. We had a male president before. Is there any evidence that the appeal to black voters, black men, will be different with a Harris presidency than with a
Well, we have pretty good data that Democrats have much larger problem with black men than black women. If you look at where they're losing support, it's more among black men than black women. Again, there's this class element here. It's really hard to get data on black working class men. It's just, they don't break it down that far. But my guess would be that would still be a problematic area for them. I think it makes sense, given what we know about the proclivities of black women versus black men, that Harris will benefit more from the identification thing with black women than with black men, and black men are still going to be a vulnerable constituency for Democrats, even with the Kamala Harris constituency candidacy. So, yeah, I always hesitate to speak without copious amounts of backup data. Anecdotally, it suggests a lot, some black men are less than completely delighted with Kamala Harris.
One of the ways that she failed in 2020 was that she did not leverage her history as a prosecutor. And because the moment in 2020 among Democrats, criminal justice reform was such a driving issue, and so she oversteered and defund the police kind of rhetoric and that kind of stuff as she was auditioning for the left of her party. And when I say, will they let her win, what I mean is, so far, her message is, I'm a prosecutor. And that was not something in 2020 that Kamala Harris wanted to say, right?
Chris, their message as a prosecutor is, I was a prosecutor, and because I prosecuted criminals, I know criminals, and that's why I know Donald Trump. It's not really about being tough on crime, it's about being tough on Donald Trump, which I think is a very different kind of approach. If you really want to reach voters who are more in the center, you actually have to transmit the idea. Not only are you a prosecutor, you believe in being tough on crime. You believe in putting more police officers on the street. You believe in actually getting, what people think of as crime. Trump's a criminal, I get it. You're into that. Yeah, you got to start somewhere. But she did say at one point, right? And she's on record in this. It's I think it's in the McCormick commercial. Right. If we put more police on, everybody knows if you put more police on the street, it does have any effect on crime.
And would that be a good place for her to say to persuadable moderate voters to make it very clear that she favors strong law enforcement presence and all that stuff?
Again, I think so. Yeah. But the reality is she's got a lot of choices here in terms of where to make those stands. But I would say, I think the way she's talking about being a prosecutor, surely it is against Donald Trump and it stands in contrast to Donald Trump. But the fact that people are getting to learn she was a prosecutor and prosecuted criminals, and that's a first step, and that's something that most people didn't know before, and increasingly people are coming to know. So yes, it's about Trump, but it's about more than Trump, I think.
We have a question right here. He's been patiently waiting. Sir.
Thank you. JP Hogan. I'm trying to understand the messaging of her first week with, the day after the announcement, the anointing, Newsom starts rustling up the homeless. Is that her as Al Haig? Is that her as Dukakis wanting a California miracle? Does she get blamed for rustling up the homelessness to have a clean sweep of California? So she's the new thing, but while she's the new thing, how does Biden and Newsom change the California policy on homelessness overnight on the night she's become anointed?
How does California, Sarah, you mentioned San Francisco liberal. That was, some of us may remember, a Massachusetts liberal. We're talking about Michael Dukakis John Kerry is a Massachusetts liberal, which carried freight in the 80s and at the turn of the century. how does the California brand affect the way that Republicans go after Kamala Harris?
Maybe she shouldn't ride in a tank. Maybe that's a good.
Don't ride in a tank, no helmet, no helmet.
That would actually help her if she did
Yeah,
that.
that's right.
In this electorate, perhaps. I think it's one biographical factor. I do think that, look, most of the people that matter in this election in terms of determining who's going to win, what we've all determined is a very narrow election, haven't tuned in very much, and they're not very tuned in. And so, while crime has been up in most major metropolitan areas, San Francisco is having a tax problem because people are leaving, because of crime and homelessness issues, because of sort of the decriminalization, a lot of these things. Like, how much of that gets pinned on her? Like, probably not very much. Like, that's a California problem. She is a Californian with largely the same governing philosophy as most of the California Democrats, but that's a state problem. That's a Newsom has been in office 8 years-ish problem. So I don't think that impacts her. I think the question we've been debating it is like, does she take advantage of the opportunity to come on a convention speech and say, we're going to stand with Israel, I'm going to be tough on crime? Like, Mark says maybe she will, we think she won't, but we'll see. Because that will determine whether she can win, in my view. Can she speak to the country? Can she convince them she is something other than what I think kind of gut level perception is probably going to be of her?
Nate Moore, does the internet have any questions? We got one? It's coming in hot? Is it just a barbecue recipe, or is it a real question from the internet?
We have a real question from Linda, who asks, or says, many Senate Democrats are still polling 10 or so points ahead of Kamala. Could these senators help Harris, or is it more likely she drags them down? Or are we returning to an era of ticket splitting?
Who wants to attack reverse coattails first? Who wants to go?
Chris, I think you're well qualified.
No, you lay it out there, Roy. Reverse coattails. Will these overperforming Democrats help win these states for the presidential?
No.
No, this is correct, Linda. He is correct.
But the second point is, I do think there are some good incumbents. Incumbency is a benefit for Democrats, but I think part of what we see in the polling is, again, relatively unknown challengers on the Republican side. So I expect in some places some of those numbers will just naturally close up a bit as we get to know the candidates, as people return to their partisan places. That's not to say that, again, some of these close states, Democrats wouldn't pull out many of the races. I do think that part of what we're seeing is just this unknown phenomenon on the part of the Republican challengers.
Yeah, these days it's just pretty hard to run ahead of the presidential candidate in a presidential election for a Senate candidate. So we would expect those advantages to compress rather than sort of drag the presidential candidate up. The presidential candidate in their performance over time is more likely to drag the Senate candidate down than the reverse. And so, not to say all these people are going to lose, but, they're definitely, as the race becomes more well-defined, people know who these Republican challengers are, as John's pointing out, that's the more likely outcome than,
there can be brand consequences. How the Republican brand looks in North Carolina after Mark Robinson is done with it may not be helpful to Trump. There may be some downdraft there. How well Ruben Gallego does is reinventing himself as a moderate in Arizona versus how well Carrie Lake does at reinventing herself as normal. I don't know but I do think that there are relationships, but the reverse coattails, if they're understood to be that you help the top of the ticket, I think there's very little evidence of that.
I'd just say very quickly, the long-term trend here has been towards an increasing correlation between presidential vote, Senate vote, House vote, even governor's vote. So that's the long-term trend, and as Roy and as Chris said, you'd expect those numbers to come closer together over time and come closer to where the president is rather than have the president come closer to where the Senate is. But I would disagree with Chris a bit on the quality of the Republican candidates. Yes, it's better than it was last time, but we got a lot of people with a lot of problems running in these states. against Sherrod Brown, against John Tester in Nevada, against Jackie Rose and others. So candidate quality does make a difference in a Senate race, and there is, I would argue, a yawning gap in candidate quality in a number of these states, and that's going to help Democrats. The problem, of course, is, as Chris rightly said, is that we can only afford to lose one, right. And that's the problem.
We have a question over here.
Atman Vakil, AEI. My question was about the Senate race in Maryland, not just the impact of Larry Hogan in Maryland, but also drawing Democratic money away from other states where it might be close. What would be that?
Who wants it?
I don't think that's going to happen. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I think Angela Elster-Brooks is going to win that race. I think there's really no evidence other than past performance that suggests that Larry Hogan has much of a chance of winning that Senate race. And I think, you know, she's going to raise money here as he has. But the people who support Democrats nationally in Maryland are going to continue supporting those national Democrats. They're not going to just focus on Maryland alone.
And I guess I would add that, look, I think Larry Hogan is obviously the best candidate Republicans could ever hope for in Maryland, gives them, you know, some sort of chance. But there really is a difference between running as a governor in a very blue state and running as a senator. You're much more nationalized. He's tied to or has to push himself away from the national campaign. Democrats who've succeeded in Kentucky and Louisiana, Republicans in Massachusetts and Maryland as governors, that rarely translates into a Senate race. So I think it's just not the same race for Larry Hogan as he was able to win in his governor's race.
And I think this race gives you a good insight on the effect that Harris will have on Democrats. Joe Biden, running in Maryland, wins Maryland in a low turnout election in Maryland, as he was going to win no matter what. And that's a universe in which Larry Hogan maybe can throw that perfect spiral at 60 yards right through the tire, hit it just right, get enough ticket splitters in a low turnout election and get those suburbanites from DC area and maybe get through. You turn up the volume just a little bit on the electorate in Maryland and he gets swamped because you have an African-American woman running for Senate, you have an African-American woman, a black woman running for president, you have the enthusiasm go up, and not good news for Larry Hogan.
Let's just put it this way, not to belabor this, but if you look at the governor's race, the Senate race, and the House races last time, Democrats won each of those, the House races for the state as a whole, by 30 points. That's just a lot to make up. I mean, just a lot to make up.
It ain't going to happen. One thing that we haven't discussed here that I think is actually pretty important, and it relates to turnout, but overall, I mean, I think all the data suggests, and I'm hardly the only person to say this, that Democrats will benefit from a relatively low turnout presidential election, because the kind of voters who are more peripheral are actually much more sympathetic to Trump, much more available to him. So one question that's interesting to ask is, now that it's Harris-Trump instead of Biden-Trump, does that make it a higher turnout election or a lower turnout election? You could argue it would make it higher turnout because a lot of, if it was going to be Trump-Biden, I mean, you could see a lot of people being kind of complacent. It's, the outcome's decided. But now I think it's much more of a dogfight. So does that make it a higher turnout election? And it's going to be pretty bitter down toward the end, I think. There's going to be a lot of, revving up of the bases on both sides. So I think it's kind of interesting, to think about whether we're actually more likely to be in a high turnout environment in this election. And based on all the data we've seen, that would actually benefit Trump more than
And I
Harris.
want to leave that as a very profound question we can all ponder, as we know that Election Watch is a series, and we are here in July, but we will be back again in September, October, and just after the election in November. So with this, I'd like to thank my co-host here, Chris Stirewalt, Rui Teixeira, Sarah Fagan, and Mark Melman for joining us at Election Watch.